Master brewer Papa Paul Selle is going to explain how you brew beer. Action.
Well, first you have to find a place to do your brewing. It needs to be a place where you can leave the beer for at least 2 weeks, or maybe a little longer than that, depending on the recipe, what kind of beer you're going to brew. And that means that you have to have a dark space so that you don't have any sunlight coming in to damage the fermentation process. Once you've found that place, make sure that it's going to be available for at least 2 weeks minimum. Then you can start assembling all your materials and things to get the process going. You may be using wheat, you may be using a combination of wheat and barley, or maybe there's even some other kinds of grains that you're going to be using with that to give it a little bit of your own unique flavors. So you find a piece of equipment like a mash tun, which would be maybe a cooler that would hold at least 6 gallons of water minimum. Hopefully you can get a little bit more than that in there so that you're going to end up with 5 gallons of good beer when you're done with it. Once you've got your mash tun, then you grind your grains, if you haven't already got them ground, and put them in the mash tun. You've got your water already heating in a kettle all by itself, a boil kettle. You put that kettle, of course, on either an electric stove or preferably a gas-fired burner, because that'll give you quicker heat and it'll last a little bit longer for you. You heat your water up to a little bit above 170, 180 degrees would be just about right on a regular good weather day. If it's cold weather, you might have to heat it up a little bit more than that. But then you get your water heated up, you start putting the water to the mash tun. And you can do that several ways. You're doing it with a kettle that you can pour the water into a kettle and then pour the kettle into the mash tun. And you stir it as you pour it in there. A lot of times you will be adding the mash tun grains as you're adding the water, so that you get a uniform mix of water with the grains, rather than having to stir the whole mix up all at once.
So now the mash tun, you said it's like a cooler.
It could be a regular cooler.
Okay, so that kind of thing will take heated water too, not just cold water. It won't destroy it.
Normally they will.
Okay.
That's the kind you want to get, of course, is a good Coleman heater, or a good Coleman cooler. And you'll find those at just about any hardware store, anywhere you go. Even in the good old Fred Meyer, you'll find them there too. So there you start. You got your water heated. You start adding the grain and the water at the same time, and that'll be the best way to do this, because that maintains your water and your mash mix uniformly all the way up to the top of the mash tun. Once you get your water added and your mash tun full, you let it set for about an hour. That's enough time usually to get all of the grains soaked in the water that will extract the good juices out of the grains. Once you've done that, then you can transfer that water and everything into a carboy. If you've got hops to add, this is when you would add the hops normally, right at the end of the boil period. And that way your hops will be fresh, either fresh hops or dried hops.
And a lot of people here in Oregon grow their own hops like you do, right?
Yeah, you can use your own hops, but you want to make sure that when you pick them either and dry them or you pick them and freeze them, because they'll spoil otherwise. You don't want to leave them just green laying around till they dry by themselves. You want to get them dried with a dryer, or, like I say, freezing is usually the easiest way to do that. You put them in, try to keep the varieties separate, because you know each variety has a little different flavoring in it. Your Willamettes will be one kind, and your other different varieties will have a different flavor to them. Your Centennials will have a little sharper edge than the Willamettes will. Willamette seems to be a pretty popular one around that most everybody can get a hold of.
What kind of hops are in the Super Dog from the Lucky Lab?
It has Super Dog from the Lucky Lab. It has about four different hops to it. And I don't remember all their names, so I'd rather not try to guess them right this minute.
And what does the C note from the Lompoc have? They all start with C, right?
They all start with C. They got 7 different kinds of hops with them. C's, one of them starts with W, but they don't tell you that.
So, oh, you're giving away Jerry Fechter's secrets. Oh,
Yeah,
oh no.
Jerry doesn't know that.
Hey, so if you're fortunate and you have someone like you that teaches you about beer, you can go to the Lucky Lab when they do their hop harvest, and you can hang out and drink free Super Dog or whatever else they're drinking, and harvest hops. And I did that with you, and that was really fun. So,
Right,
all right.
that's a good time. That's usually in September when they have the hop harvest there. And what happens is they also have the dog people there at the same time, so they call it the Dogtoberfest. And they're usually harvesting their own hops as well as hops that are brought in by various friends and neighbors that are growing hops for the fun of it or for the real good fresh hop beers that you can make with fresh hops. And when they do that Dogtoberfest, usually the fresh hop that they make out of that is a mixture of hops. You never know exactly what hops they use because they just mix them all together and call it a fresh hop beer. Once they do their fresh hop beer, then they go back to their own recipes and use just specific hops for different beers.
What kind of hops do they use for the Papa Paul's Pilsner?
They use very little hops in the Papa Paul's Pilsner. If they're using any at all, it would probably be Willamettes, maybe Centennials, but they try to use a hop that doesn't have a huge hop ending to it when you drink it.
So, but they use more hops than Coors or Butt Wiper beer, right?
Oh, obviously, because there's very few hops in Budweiser beer.
Okay, so we've gotten to the hops part. You're using the hops in the brew process. So then what happens?
Well, then you let the beer in a carboy, usually using a 6 to 7 gallon carboy, a big one. That way you're going to at least get 5 gallons of beer out of it. And you let that set for at least 14 days, but you watch it every day. You take a look at it because it's going to start foaming as it starts to ferment. And you want to make sure there's enough room in there for the foam to get out without causing any contamination of it. So if you're concerned about that, you can put a cork in it and have a cork that has 2 holes in it. One for you can control the incoming air to it so that there's no contamination to it, and you can control the outflowing foam that might come up out of it by dumping it in a bucket that you sit right beside it. And that's usually a little bit of a trial and error basis till you figure out how to do that several times, and you'll get it down to a system that you'll use for then on, I'm sure. Now, what else do I need to tell you about now when it comes to making the beer?
Well, so then how long does it take for it to become beer? And you have to trust where it's stored so nobody drinks it before you get back to it, right?
Well, not only that, you don't want anybody even touching it. You should check on it about every day, though, and see how it's doing. And it needs to be in a dark room, so there's no daylight getting into that room. That way, you protect that beer from ultraviolet degradation. That's one of the reasons a lot of the beers are being canned nowadays, because you don't have any light that can damage even the finished beer, because it will age it, and a little bit too much a lot of times in bottles. So when you're buying bottled beer in the store, you want to look at it and see if you can find out when it was brewed, so you aren't going to be buying something that's been sitting on a shelf for a long time.
And so how long before you get to drink the beer? How long does it sit there? 2 weeks, you said?
I would say 2 weeks minimum, and then you can sample it. But you want to let it age a little longer than that. You want to put it in a corny keg, a Cornelius keg. It's at least 6 gallons. Kegs are usually 5 to 6 gallons, and some of them are half kegs. They'll be 1.5.
So they're not funny kegs. They're not corny funny. They're just Cornelius.
Cornelius
Okay.
is the name of a Cornelius that first made these kegs and used them for their test batches of beer. But that beer in a corny keg has to be carbonated with carbon dioxide. You want to make sure that it's fully carbonated so that it's going to age properly and be a good clean beer when you're ready to tap it. So once you tap it, then you want to put it in bottles. If you're going to store it for a long time, I would put it in bottles, but otherwise you're going to have to leave it in the corny keg, because that's the only other place you've got to put it.
Then you invite a bunch of people to come over and say, "Here, have some beer.
Yeah,
Cheers to
you wanna make sure that
beers."
it's good in age, though, before you do that. So the 14 days is just the bare minimum in my book. And you want to check on it after that. And maybe it might take as much as 30 to 40 days for it to age properly, so that it's really done with its fermentation, and you won't have any flocculation of debris in the bottles when you bottled it, or in the cornucopia, either one. Then you're ready to invite your friends over and have real beer, not just the Budweiser beer.
All right. Well, what are we going to celebrate on May 21st at the Lucky Lab on Quimby?
We're going to celebrate Papa Paul's Pilsner release that day.
6th year.
6th year that they've done this.
So everyone's invited at 6:30 to the Northwest Quimby Lucky Lab, and Micro Blues 2 Pints, Christopher McGuire and drummer girl Melissa are going to play a special song and some more tunes about beer for Papa Paul, and you're all invited to come out and celebrate the man, the myth, the legend, Papa Paul, Frederick Selle, the wonderful man of God and wonderful brewer.